Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Generation 9/11 for Thursday, April 29th. I'm your host, Sean Hall, the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. It's great to see so many familiar faces tonight, and for a very important and interesting conversation on what is the day prior to the anniversary of the fall of Saigon. So it sounds like there's some correlation there, but you tell me if we're making maybe a bigger deal of it than we probably should. But I'm interested to dive into those correlations here. And joining me as my wingman tonight is Todd DiPastino. Todd, how are you tonight?
Oh, I'm doing great. And I've got to tell you, when Wes Morgan came into the room before we started, I had to admit to him that I've kind of been obsessed with him for the past week. Once I read his story, he's written this wonderful book that is getting rave reviews from all kinds of different reviewers. And then in his backstory, I learned that the book essentially began as a college research paper. That as a college student, he went to Afghanistan. And when I read about that, I just thought, what do you think my number one thought was, Sean?
I'm going to assume it might be about his parents.
Yeah. What kind of parents? I mean, oh my gosh. So anyhow, that's my little lame introduction to Wes, but I've been very much looking forward to this conversation.
Well, I pulled up some pictures, Wes, that I found of you online. Your book, The Hardest Place, I have been diving into it this past week and have really been enamored with it. It's such a well-told story, and boy, does it fires you out of a cannon right at the beginning with this idea of a manhunt, black ops, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, CIA. You know, there's intrigue that really dives you into what this story is, and I'm excited to talk with you about it tonight. Also joining us is retired Army Colonel Dennis McGurk. Dennis, how are you tonight?
I am well, Sean. Thank you. And thanks everybody for having me on. It's really an honor. Although now I hope I get to go second or not at all after having heard Wes's story. I'm just not going to be able to compare to that, but I'll give it my best shot. Over.
Bad luck then tonight, because I had you going first.
Oh, well, however you want to do it's fine.
Wes, where are you joining us from?
I'm in Washington, D.C. in my little tiny studio apartment, so that there may be a cat that runs by at some point as well.
That's okay. I got two of them, and I'm sure you might hear something fall or being scratched down here. I might, dive over and, throw one of them because they just love to rip up the furniture down in my little office down here. But well, I'm so excited for both of you to join us to talk about the withdrawal of the Afghan troops that is set for September 11th. But I figured I would take a quick step back, sort of talk about where we are in Afghanistan, open it up to the room later. I'm sure everybody will have questions here, and to talk about their stories. Dennis, I'm interested to get into your history in Afghanistan and your thoughts on what the withdrawal means for the region. And obviously, Wes, with your incredible knowledge of the history of the Afghan War and your time there as well, to sort of see, what do you think it's going to be like on the ground there? Now, this war started 20 years ago as mostly a counterterrorism mission to depose the Taliban, find Osama bin Laden. Eventually, it really expanded and evolved and into one that was sort of nation building, and democratization, securing women's rights, part of it. But over the course of the last 20 years, nearly 2,400 American troops have died in Afghanistan in a conflict that has cost the Americans $2 trillion. Very expensive war. And where we're at now, the U.S. signed a peace agreement with the Taliban in February of 2020, titled the Agreement for Bringing Peace to Afghanistan. And part of the terms include the withdrawal of all American and NATO troops from Afghanistan, a Taliban pledge to prevent al-Qaeda from operating in areas under Taliban control, and talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. At the time, the United States agreed to an initial reduction of the force levels. At that time, it was about 13,000 down to about 8,600 by July of last year, followed by a full withdrawal within 14 months if the Taliban kept its commitments. The original deadline for the full withdrawal was supposed to be actually this coming Saturday, May 1st. That has been extended to September 11th, which marks that 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And the peace talks, and correct me if I'm wrong, the peace talks have pretty much stalemated at this point, in part because of the withdrawal and because of prisoner exchanges. There's a lot of things that just couldn't get off the ground that sort of stalled everything out. the U.S. currently has about 3,500 troops in the country, and there are about around 7,000 other forces as part of the allied coalition supporting the Afghan government, the majority of them being NATO troops. Now, as we start to get into both the idea of for and against bringing the troops out of there by September 11th, first, I want to ask Wes, because this question has been bouncing around in my mind, all day, is, do you ever get sick of talking about Afghanistan?
I'm going to say no. I mean, I've pretty much spent my adult life on Afghanistan, working in Afghanistan, working on Afghanistan subjects. And it's really near and dear to my heart. So I'm always really, really happy and grateful to have the chance to talk about it with an interested audience.
How did it become near and dear to your heart? Why Afghanistan?
I don't know how long you want me to go, but
as long as you like, really.
I was a military history nerd as a kid, and 9/11 happened when I was in 8th grade. And it, very quickly it sort of felt like, well, these wars that I have always been reading books about they're going to involve my generation and my country and my future. And when I got to college, kind of my idea was, I'm going into ROTC. That seems like sort of the well-trodden path to go over and see these wars and learn about them firsthand, is become a Army officer of some sort. But I also pretty quickly had a different opportunity that led me to drop ROTC after a couple years and take a different path, which was after my freshman year, I had kind of a out of the blue, bizarre opportunity to go start covering first the war in Iraq as a freelancer. So in 2007, and then continued Iraq again in 2008, and then started going to Afghanistan in 2009, and just got really hooked on the place, and in particular on this one corner of the country up in the Northeast that's a really, really remarkable part of the country. It's extraordinarily beautiful. It's also been extraordinarily violent and difficult for U.S. troops to operate in, called the Pesh Valley in Kunar and Nuristan provinces.
And I do have a picture on the cover of your book. I'm going to pull up a picture of that. Is this really great shot of the Pesh Valley and a soldier overlooking that region. Let me pull that up here.
Sure. Yeah, that photo is actually one that I took in 2010 on my first Pesh trip.
You took this picture?
Yeah, the top one. The lower one is a very famous Army photo by an Army combat camera photographer. So they kind of show two different periods in the war. The lower one was taken in 2003 when it was beginning. And then the upper one I took in 2010 when U.S. forces were kind of in essentially a stalemate in the Pesh Valley, and things had gone as far as they were going to go.
Did you spend a lot of time researching sort of where we had been in Afghanistan before your first time there embedding?
Yeah, I mean, that was not initially. I mean, what I was doing initially was I would spend the summers. I would go and spend 3 or 4 months bouncing around Afghanistan, embedding with different U.S. and British infantry battalions, basically, and just covering their day-to-day life. Writing reports for New York Times' At War blog and other outlets, basically describing, okay, this is this battalion, this lives in this very difficult district, and this is what their life is like and what their combat operations are like. But then when I got to the Pesh, I got really interested in it. And so when I came home from that trip and I went back to college for my final year, I started digging into kind of how we had gotten to the Pesh, because I had seen this unusual moment there in the summer of 2010, where, to set the bigger picture a little, I mean, the summer of 2010 was really the peak of U.S. efforts in Afghanistan. There were approaching 100,000 U.S. troops in the country. That number had tripled over the course of about a year and a half as the Obama administration began its surge. And all throughout the country, U.S. troops were spreading out, and they were applying this counterinsurgency strategy of building new outposts to kind of bring more of the population under government protection and control. So everywhere you go would be, battalion commander would tell you on your in brief, well, look, these are the new outposts we're building. These are the new roads we're building. This is how much reconstruction money we're spending and we plan to spend. And this is how much more progress we're going to have made, in 6 months when we hand it off to the next unit. But when I got to this battalion in the Pesh Valley, which was a group of about 700 soldiers from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, from the 101st Airborne Division, they were called the Bulldog Battalion, 1327 Infantry. And they were locked into this very intense fight of a sort that I hadn't really seen before. It was not this the war of kind of just going out around, driving around and doing presence patrols and stepping on IEDs and kind of losing guys, but never really seeing much of the enemy. It was a much more intense kind of direct fire fight, where they were just in just endless gun battles, long distance gun battles with the enemy. And there wasn't a lot of time for kind of shuras and governance work and stuff like that. There was artillery being exchanged in quantities that I had probably never seen cumulatively in all my other embeds. And yet it's kind of seemed like on the two sides, you'd be at an outpost. Say the outpost of the mouth of the Korengal Valley was a place called Cott, Michigan. And it was this little place in a fishbowl. The enemy could look down into it from everywhere. They had full observation of anything that was going on inside the base, essentially outdoors. And a good chunk of every day would be consumed with attacks on the base and fighting back against those attacks on the base. And yet it was not. It was clear that things were different now than they had been a couple of years before. The American troops were taking casualties on these bases, but not a lot of them, because they had really built these bases up into kind of these little fortresses, little concrete fortresses. I mean, between the HESCOs and the T-walls and they really were battened down, and they had these big armored vehicles kind of stationed all around the perimeter that would return fire with. So there was really had it down to a science, kind of how you react to contact when these attacks start. And so did the enemy up in the hills. I mean, you really got the sense that when these firefights started, the enemy knew exactly how many minutes it was going to be before the outposts' mortars started hitting in the hills. They knew exactly how many minutes beyond that it was going to be before the 155 howitzer shells started falling from the nearby firebase Blessing. And they knew exactly how long it was going to be before Apaches showed up and before JDAMs could start falling from jets. So, it's not that people weren't being hurt on these two sides. I mean, Americans and Taliban were both being killed, but not in great numbers. And you really got the impression that who was being hurt the most was the people in the villages kind of in between, the people who lived in these villages around the outposts, which, these outposts had been put there ostensibly to create kind of a security bubble to make the people safer from the Taliban.
And if I may interrupt real quick,
yeah.
Blessing was the first one that was placed there?
The first one in the valley, yes, in 2003. There had been another one in 2002 outside the valley, but yes. But so you got the strong impression in 2010 that what had once been a security bubble was now kind of a bubble of danger surrounding each of these American outposts, where the American outposts, rather than projecting security, were sucking in violence. And the population just kind of was just trying to make it. They weren't really interested in collaborating with either side more than the extent that was sort of required for their survival. The battalion commander in the valley at FOB Blessing was a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Joe Ryan. He's since gone on to be, he's a one-star general back in Kabul now on his 8th Afghanistan deployment. I think his 11th or 12th total war on terror deployment. Gonna take command of the 25th Infantry Division pretty soon. So he has, he's continued to move on and up. But in 2010, what was really striking to me was that he just took a very different tone about what his unit was doing in the Pech than all of his sort of peer battalion commanders that I had been encountering in other parts of Afghanistan. He essentially was saying that he felt it was time for troops to leave the particular valley that he was in, that they had worn out their welcome, and that it just was done. That they accomplished what they were trying to accomplish to the extent that they were going to. And he wasn't saying we failed or anything like that, but he was using language that just kind of suggested it's time to go. And he was at that very time kind of trying to pitching a withdrawal to his own superiors, to the brigade commander and the division commander. And indeed, by within a year, I mean, as I was kind of finishing up my senior thesis project back at school, U.S. troops did pull out of the Pech Valley. He was successful in pitching this pullout, and it seemed like kind of this neat ending to a project that when I had gone home from this trip, I had spent a lot of time sort of trying to figure out where all these bases had come from, how they'd gotten there, when they'd gotten there, all that kind of thing. But then the story kept going because as you kind of go along, I mean, U.S. forces get sucked back into the valley. So it wound up being, I showed up at kind of a midpoint of the two-decade U.S. effort in this part of the country. And so the two kinds of things that I did for the book were, one, I tried to rewind the tape and figure out how did each of these little bases get there back in 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, long before I had ever set foot in the place. And then I also tried to, kind of keep up with through repeated trips and through interviewing guys when they were over there and when they got home and everything, keep up with what was going on as the war continued to unfold there. Yeah.
And mostly we went into there after Tora Bora looking for Osama bin Laden, correct?
Yeah. So the interesting thing was, 2010, you'd go to a place like Cott, Michigan or Fob Blessing, and really nobody at the base could tell you much about why that base was there or when it had first been established or why. And so it took some doing to kind of trace these back, to get the company commander to introduce you to the company commander who was there before him and have him introduce you to the company commander who was there before him, and he'd introduce you to the Green Beret team leader who was there before him, and eventually you might get to, the Delta Force guy or the CIA guy who had been part of the initial force that first set up this position, some years earlier. And what it had begun as was something much, much narrower and smaller than this kind of violent stalemate that I saw in 2010. It had begun as a manhunting operation. Some SEALs and Delta Force guys and CIA officers had driven up into the province in pickup trucks in the spring of 2002, about 6 or 7 months after 9/11, and they were trying to figure out where bin Laden had gone because he had gotten away from them during the Battle of Tora Bora in December of 2001. And they were trying to pick up the trail. So these little teams, they were going out, they're spreading out in the Afghan East, just trying to develop sources and pick up on rumors and gossip and figure out where Al-Qaeda Arabs had gone to. And that was the sort of the very limited, narrow mission that brought us up there, and which we didn't accomplish. I mean, they were always pretty close behind bin Laden, it turns out, probably closer in Kunar than they knew at the time. I mean, it turns out he did stay in Kunar for a period of time after Tora Bora. But they were always too far behind. The operations in Kunar never really contributed in any way to his eventual capture years and years, or his eventual killing years and years later at Abbottabad in 2011. But what happened instead was just the mission kept kind of snowballing, kind of in these, you call it snowballing, but it was subtle. I mean, it was as units rotated through, Green Beret teams every 6 months, new Marine platoons every 6 months, and then you get Army infantry battalions that come in for 12 months or 15 months. And during each of these transitions, and then during each of the subsequent deployments, the mission would expand a little bit. For years and years, there was no retracting happening. It was every new unit would come in and just kind of interpret the mission a little more expansively. They'd look at, what their predecessor had accomplished, and they'd say, well, we can do a little more than that. We can build off of that. And so you see it expand from kind of this narrow counterterrorism manhunting thing to now there's Green Berets out in the valley in 2004, sort of trying to build a local militia that could later be incorporated into the Afghan army. They think that's sort of the way to do it. But eventually their headquarters loses interest and pulls them out. And a bunch of Marines are left there trying to do the same thing. But of course, that's not really what Marines are trained to do, build up local security forces. So inevitably, they kind of start doing more U.S. only, offensive operations into some of these valleys surrounding the Pesh, going after enemy fighters who are starting to attack the base. And then 2006 is a big inflection point. I mean, the Army kind of really doubles down. It throws a battalion into the Pesh Valley and starts building outposts all over the place. And that's when things kind of start to spin out of control.
And with these different units that are coming in and coming out, you mentioned in the book that there's 2 different wars actually going on.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to think of it. It's at least it's the way I think of it because when I was embedded with the military back during the surges in both Iraq and Afghanistan, I was essentially seeing one side of what the military was doing. I was seeing kind of the daytime counterinsurgency war that conventional forces were fighting. And to a degree, I was seeing, what some special operations forces were doing, Green Berets working with their kind of militias and their Afghan commando counterparts. But there was this other war going on, kind of a pretty nocturnal nighttime war that JSOC was fighting, the Joint Special Operations Command Task Force with the Rangers and SEAL Team 6. And they were, often working out of the same bases, or a little larger bases a little farther back. They were running this kind of nighttime manhunting campaign, initially going after Al-Qaeda leaders, then going after Taliban leaders, eventually going after kind of even very small time, essentially the equivalent of like squad leaders in the Taliban insurgency, just going out there and grabbing them and killing them at night. And this was sort of another side of the war that wasn't visible to embedded reporters because JSOC was off limits. Mm-hmm. So it took me, years after these trips to kind of go and find the guys who had been in these Ranger and SEAL units and talk to them about their experiences, and sort of try and match up their war with the parallel war that I'd been seeing. So that's the way the two wars that I think of are kind of this nighttime counterterrorism war and this daytime counterinsurgency war. It's not really as simple as that, but I think it's a good way of thinking about it.
You can definitely tell in reading the book, it's meticulously detailed and researched, to a point where I love reading it on my Kindle because I can easily catch the footnotes, pop to the back of the book, read about how you talked with this person, the history of that, and then pop back into the story. And I'm constantly popping back and forth, just getting more and more like into how you develop this entire like world that I feel like I'm getting into. If I may take, it's a great sort of macro view as we take a look here at the actual map of where you were in the Pesh Valley. Why do you think this area was such a concentration for Taliban, Al Qaeda? Why did they go there?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it initially wasn't really. I mean, so this part of the country before 9/11 was not really Taliban controlled. There were Taliban in the provincial capital, but the Taliban was an outside force. I mean, they had come down, they come from their heartlands in southern Afghanistan, and they had sort of come in and exerted a minimal amount of control in Kunar by 2001. And really the province was controlled by kind of a set of local strongmen or warlords or whatever you want to call them. I mean, just kind of these big local power brokers who controlled chunks of terrain. And some of them had kind of made alliances with the Taliban. Others of them had made alliances with the Northern Alliance, the guys who were fighting the Taliban. And so there was not a strong Taliban presence in Kunar before 9/11. And really there was no Al-Qaeda presence that we know of. I mean, we have a pretty good idea of where all the Al-Qaeda camps were pre-9/11, and not one of them was in Kunar. Of course, it winds up being a hotbed for both of these groups. And I think in large part, that's because of the role that U.S. forces played there. I mean, U.S. forces went up there looking for Al-Qaeda, which wasn't really there. I mean, there was Bin Laden passed through briefly, but he was hiding underground. They didn't find him. But as U.S. forces spread out and sort of did their hunt, they started to make enemies. I mean, not deliberately. I mean, these were U.S. troops who were acting in good faith and were doing the best that they could in a pretty alien environment, a place where it's not just that there's a foreign language that they have to have interpreters for, it's that there are about 8 foreign languages that they have to have interpreters for. Kind of each of these little side valleys, like the Korengal and the Waingal, has its own language that becomes very, very difficult to kind of penetrate from an intelligence perspective, whether that's recruiting informants or whether it's, listening to and translating, their signals intelligence traffic.
Dennis, I saw you shaking your head at that. I just wanted to hear, did you deal with that in your deployments? Just the consistent miscommunications of different languages, different dialects all through? Have you asked you to unmute, Dennis? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just shaking my head because my experience was so different with I was looking at what was the impact of the war on the mental health of service members, particularly soldiers, and later also some Marines. So I was just shaking my head on the difference of it didn't matter. I actually remember a funny quick story walking in, and I was coming from Silver Spring, Maryland, the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and I walked into one of the talks, and it said Terps needed dial some number. And I thought, the Maryland Terps, somebody's looking out for their buddies here from Maryland. And then somebody goes, that's interpreter. That's where I was coming in as an Army research psychologist. So I'll pause with that story if it makes anybody laugh as they think about it for a minute. Maryland are the Terps, turtles. Very different than an interpreter. Sorry, Wes, back to you.
No worries at all. That's pretty funny.
Wes, you obviously did some interviews out into the Pesh Valley as well. Did you have to take interpreters with you everywhere, different interpreters consistently?
I did. I would use, once I was not doing embeds anymore and I was, going and talking to people from these valleys about their experience with the Americans, And once I was doing embeds with the Afghan army after the Americans had left, that obviously required interpreters. There were interpreters I would use in Kabul who were sort of, pretty well educated guys who were used to working with Western journalists. And then there was kind of another group of interpreters that I would use when I went to Kunar, who were willing to do that because it was a pretty dangerous thing that a lot of the sort of the Kabul set of interpreters were less interested in doing. So I relied on guys who had been U.S. military interpreters up there, Afghan men who had spent some portion of their teens or 20s interpreting for American lieutenants and captains, and had kind of gotten to know the place pretty well, which was great because they not only could they kind of I'm thinking of a guy in particular named Farshad, who was the interpreter I took there on a trip in 2013. I mean, he was extraordinary because he knew all the local actors, right? I mean, we go and sit down with the district sub-governor, Haji Zalmay, and I'd want to talk to him about his experience with Americans. And Haji Zalmay remembers Farshad because Farshad used to interpret between him and Colonel Ostland, and so then, Haji Zalmay says his piece, explains all that. And then after we walk out of the room and are kind of comparing notes later that night, Farshad can say to me, well, Haji Zalmay was kind of on the take. I mean, he was making a lot of money off of the U.S. unit, so that's sort of part of his perspective. So guys like that really were able to offer a lot of nuance. The interpreters in general, I mean, not just the ones that I, hired to bring along to help me on these trips, but just as resources, as interview subjects. I mean, they're extraordinarily fascinating people to talk to because often they really have a longer timescale perspective than the U.S. troops there do, right? Mm-hmm. You're an interpreter who, you interpreted for this platoon leader and the platoon leader who replaced him, and then the company commander after that, and then the battalion commander after that. I mean, you may have just like kind of a real uninterrupted view of something that the Americans just don't have uninterrupted views of. They see it in 6 and 12 and 15 month segments.
Mm-hmm. And did any of them have history dating back all the way to the Russians?
No, I mean, interpreters.
Yeah.
No, I mean the Russians is a very fraught experience, for Afghans. The idea of former communists, there's a story that I tell in the book early on. I mean, one of the big missteps that the American military and CIA made in Kunar and Nuristan in 2003 was there was a really badly botched airstrike in a place called the Weigel Valley in the fall of 2003 that killed a lot of innocent people. 7 or 8 innocent people from the family of kind of a very well-respected local religious figure who was not involved in the insurgency. And, as best I could figure out, the reason that this happened was the CIA was played into doing it by a pair of its sources who were members of the Afghan government intelligence service that the CIA, partners with. Mm-hmm. And there was a very strong contingent of KGB trained communists in this Afghan intelligence service. This is sort of this bizarre coda to the Cold War, where the KGB and the CIA had been facing off over Afghanistan. You get 20 years later, the CIA is relying on Afghans who had been trained by the KGB to be their agents on the ground. And in this case, what seems like happened is a couple of these sort of old KGB trained guys used the CIA's eagerness to kill a particular Afghan militant to get them to drop a bomb that killed somebody else instead, targeted somebody else instead, who they had an old grudge with, dating from the jihad in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a pretty common type of story, especially in the early days in Afghanistan, is of American forces making enemies by killing and capturing the wrong people, often because they are being co-opted and used as surrogates by the very people that they think are their surrogates. And are being used to settle scores without their ever knowing it, or at least often not until much, much later.
I want to chime in, if you wouldn't mind, Wes, just to say, and I see Chu Lei has joined us. Chu has been joining us for the past week. 46 years ago, he escaped South Vietnam on a Huey helicopter, piloting a Huey helicopter, landed on the USS Midway. And it reminded me, just as you were talking, Wes, that this was a big problem in the Vietnam War. Bad intelligence, a lot of score settling local people. claiming that so and so was Viet Cong, get them. And really, it was just, it was a personal feud that really plagued the war effort in Vietnam for a long time. So I'm reminded of, history repeating itself. And then the other thing I just wanted to say is I know we have at least 3 veterans here in the room with us who served in Afghanistan apart from Dennis. And I just want to invite them, John Hawes and Peter Thens and Steve Comstock. I haven't met you yet, but I understand that you are an Afghanistan veteran. And I just want to invite you to, chime in if you have thoughts or responses as we have this conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from these guys.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, we have this really big idea of what's going on in the Pesh Valley. Obviously a very kinetic area. Was there something of a warrior mentality of they wanted to go play where the big boys play, and that's where it was like, we want to have this sort of conventionalist type war battle going on here, because a lot of what we heard back home was interchangeable. Afghan War, this is like the Pesh, the Korengal, the Kunar province, like this is where the war is happening.
Yeah, I think there was some of that. I mean, units that wound up rotating up to northeastern Afghanistan, they didn't pick their sectors. But if you were in a battalion that went up to the Pesh, you saw a type of combat that was not common in Afghanistan for conventional units. You saw this kind of go up into the mountains, hunt for the enemy, fly up there, get in gunfights with him, call in airstrikes and artillery. I mean, it was I think satisfying for a lot of soldiers, especially soldiers who either previously had or would go on to serve tours in places like Kandahar or Helmand, where there's a much more grueling, grinding kind of war against an invisible enemy who strikes at you with IEDs that appear under your feet, who you never really get to come to grips with in the same way. So I think in some ways there was kind of an addictive quality to the war in the Pesh, addictive to individual soldiers. I mean, I know plenty of guys who feature in the book who kind of engineered ways to get back to that same part of the country to get another dose for their next deployment. And I think also a little addictive for the institution of the Army. I mean, I think it was hard to leave, in part because there was really something very satisfying about those big air assaults. And I'll give the example of in 2011, after U.S. forces had pulled out of the Pesh, the 101st Airborne had spent a year engineering this pullout, making it happen. It had not been easy to make happen. And making it happen, in fact, had required doing a big air assault that kind of the generals in Kabul wanted to see before they would sign off on the pullout. They wanted to see kind of a body count of we've really bloodied the enemy on our way out. New unit rotates in. The 1st Cavalry Division takes over from the 101st in the spring of 2011. And they send the new guys back in for more air assaults. And I get into the details of this in the book, but it's a really frustrating episode for a lot of the soldiers involved, especially ones who had been in Kunar before and had sort of seen these tactics and saw them as tried and untrue tactics that just create more problems and don't solve anything. And yet you kind of there's a new division headquarters, a new brigade headquarters that rotates in and kind of wants to get its air assault in. It's the way it often appeared to officers working on these staffs. And even to subordinate commanders, company and battalion commanders, there's somebody higher in the chain of command who wants to get that air assault in during their deployment. And this winds up happening kind of over and over again.
John Hawes, I want to invite you into the conversation here as well, because I know you were in this region, correct?
Correct. It was the Korengal itself was my brigade that set that up in 2006, the Korengal outpost, and I pulled security for its grand opening.
Wow. So can I ask which company within the brigade you were part of?
Okay, I was with 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountain Division.
Yep.
And I was with the reconnaissance, the RISTA unit for the brigade. And I think it was 132 Infantry that was the main force that started it. And I flew in to support them in surveillance from the ridge lines.
You were with Colonel Fenty's squadron, 371?
Yes. Yep.
Gotcha. Yep.
Yeah. I pulled security for the grand opening of the Korengal. It was a week after Colonel Fenty was killed in the helicopter crash.
Yeah. what a time to be there. I mean, it's hard for me even to imagine. I mean, I've got all the photos and videos and, interviews with people, but it's just such a different time than when I first went there just a few years later.
Mm-hmm. And everything you're saying about like the units rotating in and out and essentially making the same mistakes over and over again as the one prior, everybody wanted their fight. And in the northeastern part of Afghanistan, that's where I spent all my time, 16 months, Kunar province. It was the Wild West. Every time you left the gate, you expected a fight. And there was so many people that were deployed at the same time. If they were in southern Afghanistan, western Afghanistan, they might have gone their whole deployment without a firefight. There might have been 1 or 2 IED attacks or, maybe a rocket attack in the distance. But it was just constant gun battles for us.
Yeah. Glad you mentioned that, John, because it was one of the questions I had was, all of this is happening in Kunar, and what's going on in the rest of Afghanistan during all of this? It didn't seem like it was quiet, but definitely much more quiet than Kunar.
Can I jump in just real quick too?
Sure, Steve. And also, which branch were you?
I was in the Army. Funny enough, I was in 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountain as well, but later. So I was in 287 Infantry. Technically, I was in the support battalion. I was a mechanic, but I was attached to 287 Infantry. And I was in Afghanistan in 2013 and 14 and Regional Command East in Logar Province. Yeah. So very close, to where we're talking about.
Yeah, you actually visited once. I'm sorry to interrupt. I visited once. It must have been the previous deployment of your unit. But in 2009, 2010, they were in Wardak Logar. I remember there was a Colonel Gallahue was the battalion commander for 287 at the time. But yeah, it's the same kind of part of the country.
Yeah. So and it was funny when we were there. I was at primarily Forward Operating Base Shank, which we didn't see a whole lot of firefights there in my role, but we did see a lot of rocketing and mortars and that kind of thing. And from what I understand, I think we turned Shank over to 3rd Infantry Division, and I think they pretty much gave it over to the Afghans. And I don't think it's there anymore, to my knowledge. But I just wanted to jump in and say that it was funny that he was in 3rd Brigade as well.
Yeah, it can be a small army for sure, despite how huge it is.
I was going to say, did a lot of people sort of know of each other? Knew what was going on at the other FOBs, the other COBs, around in through the Pesh Valley?
I think often, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but especially back at this period of the war, kind of pre-smartphones, and I think you often didn't know a lot about the bigger war at the little outpost you were at. It just was, as far as you knew, every outpost might be just like the Korengal outpost. It's sort of hard to know otherwise. But in fact, every part of the country has a very different war in many ways. There really are different flavors to it. There were parts of the country where the U.S. was applying a very light footprint much later. And that's one of the things that's important about the Pesh, I think, is that we went in there hard and heavy in terms of building a lot of outposts and putting a lot of boots on the ground at an early date. So in 2006, when 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountain went up to Kunar and Nuristan and spread out into all these little tiny positions, that wasn't really happening yet in the rest of the country. The Brits were doing a little bit of that down in Helmand under very difficult but very different circumstances. The Canadians were doing it in Kandahar, but there were large parts of the country that really had not yet had the introduction of large conventional U.S. units. So as happens a lot of the time in the course of this story, the Pesh kind of acts a little bit as a preview of what's coming later for on a bigger scale, because it's the same kind of roads and outposts counterinsurgency strategy that 3rd Brigade 10th Mountain does up in the northeast in Kunar and Nuristan. That's what then in 2009, 2010 gets applied much more broadly when the surge comes in and just floods southern Afghanistan in particular with these units, including 3rd Brigade 10th Mountain goes and does it in Kandahar in a kind of a much more frustrating in some ways deployment kind of down among the grape fields, just fighting that fight of going on patrols, waiting to step on IEDs.
I'm going to jump in here if you don't mind. I'm sorry, Sean, just because something you said really struck me. And I think Deborah Benora here in the Zoom chat has picked up on it also. Mm-hmm. We've been talking a lot with our Vietnam veterans here lately about how There were not just one Vietnam War, there were 4 of them: I Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, 4 Corps. And then there was when you served, 1964, 65, or later 70, 71, totally different wars. And then we got into talking about what did they know about what was happening in the war. And I think, George Kniss or some of the other veterans here are with us in the Zoom today said that they would rely on the new guys who were rotating in to get them up to date on what's happening in the Vietnam War, even though they've been in Vietnam for 8 or 9 months. I guess always assumed that it wasn't that way any longer, because as Deborah would put in the chat here, maybe you had Armed Forces Radio, maybe you had, I don't know, other methods of communicating and getting the news. I am curious, what did you know about the wider war when you were in Afghanistan?
Sorry, are you asking me or the Afghanistan veterans?
I'm asking the universe, but I will. Let's see. We'll try and narrow it down.
I'll hop in.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So, a couple things. I remember you didn't have, amongst unit to unit, there wasn't a conversation going on what was going on across the country. You would find out that somebody was in a battle or something big was going on when you'd go into what we call an MWR blackout. And that means that there was a casualty and they would shut down the internet and the phones for 24, 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever it was, depending on how bad the situation, to notify the next of kin. And so you didn't know anybody was really in anything serious until the MWR was shut down. As far as news, the radio, Armed Forces Radio.
Hi.
Hold on, baby.
Hi.
Hello.
How are you? Good to see you.
My daughter, Aurora.
Hi, Aurora.
Beautiful name, Aurora.
Yeah. The thing
Last time I saw you, you were a tiny baby.
Yes, she was.
But now I'm a big blow.
That's right. It's so great. Time marches on.
Yeah. There wasn't like Armed Forces Radio, but we had the internet. And we actually got more of our large scale news about the war just from what was on CNN, what was on Fox News, stuff like that, or from the phone calls and emails home.
My self-tell looks like my daddy's self.
I love it. She's our next guest, Sean Booker.
That's
She's
right.
our next guest.
Yeah, engaging.
Absolutely.
Bright-eyed.
Got my attention.
Stole the spotlight. Steve and then Peter. Steve, did you have the same experience, like finding out news about the war?
A little bit. I was, again, there much later, I believe, than John. And by the time I was there, we did have like AFN, like the TV, and like the MWR and stuff, because we'd watch WWE on it. So occasionally, like in between whatever show you're watching, they'd have like little, I guess, news updates. But from, I guess, what I gathered, it was mostly just like upbeat stuff to make you feel all right, So it'd be not really tactical news, just more stuff that make you happy. But I also didn't pay that much attention.
Peter Thens, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I actually, well, keep in mind, I was actually in the first Gulf War as well. The first Gulf War, I was a junior soldier. So to be honest with you, the only thing I was really worried about was what our mission was, because that took up all your time, regardless of what the mission was. You're just trying to put your best foot forward and do it just every day as it comes. When I went to Iraq, I was kind of a mid-level NCO. You started understanding more that you had to see the big picture, but you didn't really pay too much attention to it. You'd look at the big picture and you'd say, what part of this is going to really affect me and my soldiers, and leave it at that. Then now when I went to Afghanistan, I was dealing at an even higher level where, you had to not only know the big picture, you had to know the big picture as well and understand what little things happening would ripple out and where those effects would go to brigade and battalion levels. And if I may, one thing about interpreters as well, not so much when I was in Iraq, I worked with a lot of interpreters. I was an MP, so we had to deal with police forces, Iraqi police forces, things like that. when I was in Afghanistan, I had a very unique job. And I don't know if Wes, have you ever heard the term, the acronym PCAS?
Sounds familiar, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what it stands for.
Yeah, you know what? If you were to offer me $1 million for what the acronym is, even though I worked with it for a year, I wouldn't be able to tell you. It was a portable lie detector system.
Gotcha.
Now, when I was in Afghanistan, I was in the Helmand province, mainly working out of Leatherneck and Bastion as well. And we would actually go to all the fobs and cobs, all the little places. I ended up in places where there were like 10 soldiers, up to places where there was maybe 100 soldiers. But we would actually do periodic lie detector tests on the local nationals. Now, some of the interpreters we had were US citizens. Those were our interpreters. Those were the intelligence interpreters that were, because they had a certain level of trustworthiness. Some of the units on the ground, they didn't have American citizen interpreters. They had local national interpreters. Those were the ones we would do periodic lie detector checks on. Sometimes, and there was no bones about it. If they came back, it was even questionable. They were escorted off of the fobs, and so those were the high rotation ones. But an interesting thing about one of the interpreters I had, we called him Bobby. Of course, that wasn't his name because Americans, we have problem with other people's names, so we give them names that we are easy for us, But his father had actually been in the Afghan army when Russia invaded. To this day, he does not know what happened to his father. He said he was a little kid. His father disappeared. He was an officer in the Afghan army. He goes, his family has no idea. They know he was killed and buried somewhere. They just don't
feel
know.
like that would be pretty common amongst a lot of the tribes or families in Afghanistan. Thank you, Peter. Ben Wright asked a question about the interpreters. I want to pop back to that real quick before going to Dennis. Wes, are you involved in any of the work in helping to bring interpreters over to the U.S. for their safety?
I'm not. I haven't been involved in any of that work. I keep in touch with interpreters that I worked with, and I'm lucky enough that all the interpreters I worked with are back here now in different parts of the U.S. I definitely follow pretty carefully, as administrations kind of change their policies about this stuff. And I think this is one of the things we're really waiting on, right, from the Biden administration is, as part of this pullout, is what's going to change in terms of special immigrant visas. I mean, who are we going to get out and how? Because kind of the system that we have now, that's not going to get a lot of people out fast, which is what is going to have to happen.
Popping to you, Dennis, you were in Afghanistan in 05, 07, and 2012, correct?
Correct, yes. So, what I did there was very different. And so step back just a half a step, in that I spent most of my Army career as a research psychologist. Smallest AOC in the Army, not a lot of us. Everybody's PhDs in either industrial organizational, social, or other kinds of psychology, not clinical. So early on, when people will always say, can you assess me, or tell me what's going on with me? No, I can't do that for you. But what we did, and this is the first time this has ever been done, is leaders early on, and it started in Iraq, said we need to do assessments of how our mental health is while they're in theater, and not wait till afterwards, and not wait till many years later. And so in 2003, a team was sent in with people from the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, is where I was. They did the research behind it. They sent a chaplain, they sent a social worker, they sent a clinical psychologist, they sent experimental psychologist, they sent a senior NCO, and a team that went in there to really, with never any precedence of how do you do a mental health assessment theater-wise. So they went into Iraq 03, they went into Iraq in 04, and then I went in 05, the first time into Afghanistan, with a team that was led by an Army social worker colonel. I think I was still a captain. And I'll tell you, I was in Kandahar where we spent most of our time. We bopped around and did survey, distribution, collection, focus groups all over. But I remember going into Kandahar, and they still had, like, the windows were knocked out in Kandahar's airport. And we were in tents. and it was pretty, pretty rugged, but it was also, this isn't the cool war, right? This isn't the action war. All the action and all the emphasis was all still very much in Iraq. And that's, fortunate for what I was looking at, right? Because when we compared the mental health rates of service members, then it was soldiers in Iraq with those in Afghanistan, the depression, anxiety, PTSD screening rates, not diagnoses, was much lower, like somewhere around 17% down to 9%. So it was, and that's a direct result because there was less combat exposure, right? That's sort of the direct link, right? The more combat you experience, the more likely you are to experience some sort of mental health symptoms. And it was really interesting when I was there. There was a Canadian social worker, and we were in a chow hall just talking, and people were talking about, I think we're out of here 2 years, maybe even a year. This thing, we can wrap it up. And she said, we're going to need to be here 20 years. If we want to make a difference, we're going to need to go through an entire generation. And I just thought, no way.
I'm sorry, Dennis, what year was this you had this conversation?
05.
05. Oh my.
And
Yeah.
she was pretty smart to know. And we didn't stay quite that long, but now here we are, 2021. And then I went back in 07 and it was starting to pick up, right? A lot more combat experience, a lot more hot stuff going on. I went out to the Korengal Valley. I went to Blessing. I remember touching down on the way where they did Restrepo. And if you haven't seen that movie, I think for folks who wanted to see what was it like for an infantry unit in the Korengal Valley, they did a pretty good job with that movie.
Yeah,
Others may disagree.
Sebastian Younger, really great job.
And in
with
bed,
Restrepo.
just like Wes was, right? And you really got to see how those bubbas relied on each other and how they got through a pretty hairy deployment, right? With a lot of combat exposure, losses. And then I went back in 2012 and I remember going down to Kandahar, and you couldn't go near the airport because it was back sort of functioning, at least in a limited scale. There were CHUs, containerized housing units everywhere. There was a boardwalk in Kandahar with a Pizza Hut. The Canadians were there, so there was an ice hockey rink. And I just thought, man, this is a lot different than when I was there in 05. And it was a lot different, the mental health rates as well. They had each deployment I went back, they rose because there was more and more combat experiences. And Afghanistan at that time that's the place where people were dying, where people were experiencing the challenges that result in that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So the other thing that was really interesting, again, the difference between being there where there's boardwalks and Pizza Hut and coffee shops. And when I first went out and we went out to a remote outpost, I can't remember what its name was, but all those guys were in Afghanistan. Remember, this is a place, I thought I had landed on the moon when we got out of the bird, right? When we got out of the helicopter. And I remember stepping down in that Afghanistan dust that gets everywhere, that's like talcum paddle, so thin. And when I went out and I was talking to these guys, and we were talking about, what are your stressors? We were thinking it was going to be something combat related. And they said, well, we haven't showered in 78 days. We haven't had a real shower. And I just thought, man, this is different than I, was coming from, as I said, Silver Spring, Maryland. So it was a lot different there. I remember it reminded me of a deployment to Haiti back in the mid 90s and how much of a culture shock that was coming from the 25th Infantry Division. So again, I think it was a great thing. And we used to take these reports, and what we would do is we would go into theater, we would do the surveys, we would do focus groups, we would get really good. And, people talk about, soldiers aren't going to talk to you. I'll tell you what, if you go out and you go into their world and you're with them, they're going to tell you what's going on. And they're going to tell you when they have leadership problems. They're going to tell you when they have good leaders. They're going to tell you when there's BS going on. They're going to tell you what's driving their mental health and their morale and their cohesion. And so it was really rewarding and really good to do those kind of things. And I remember on my 07 deployment, one of the things we were able to assess is a lot of the behavioral health assets were on the big outposts, right? They were in Bagram, they were in Kandahar, they were at some of the other big outposts. And we were out looking at the mental health rates, and it was all the cops and the FOBs where the bubbas and some bubbettes were having the mental health issues. And I remember coming back to, he's then a colonel, he made 1-star general, commanded Brooke Army Medical Center. And I said, sir, here's the deal. Here's where your people are with the mental health issues. Here's where your behavioral health people are. And they're rotating out. And for those of you who had to get around, you know what it was like to get a hop, right? You know how irregular that was. You know how you couldn't get somewhere. Sometimes you'd get somewhere and you'd sit for days and couldn't get back to your unit. And it was just not a good way to do it. And I said, sir, your people aren't in the places where the mental health issues are. And he said, Dennis, hold up a minute. And he reached over and he got on the horn and he called the senior behavioral health guy. And he said, look, McGurk's got data here on where the behavioral health problems are and where your people are. You're moving your people to where the behavioral health problems are. No more rotations. Get out to the fobs and the cops where the people are who need you. The rotation, you got no continuity care. You can't take care of people. And oh, by the way, service members are much more likely to talk about the embedded behavioral health provider who lives with them, or the psych tech who also happens to be an E5 or an E6 who's walking around talking to them, than they are the Bubba who bops in, or the Bubette who comes in every 6 weeks. I don't know who you are. I don't know if you've experienced what I did, right? So we saw that kind of thing, and it was probably one of the most rewarding things of my nearly 26-year career, was having this guy literally, based on data we showed him, get on the horn and move people. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of a little bit of my experience there.
Can I ask, yeah. You know, there's a psychologist. So one of the units that was there up at that time was 173rd Airborne Brigade in 2007, 2008. And they're the only unit where I remember kind of hearing them talk about their brigade psychologist. There was a guy named O'Leary, who seemed like he would go out to the Korengal and who kind of left an impression. I mean, you know, I don't remember. You know, I'd ask this of subsequent units in the Korengal, and they wouldn't really talk about, you know, people having come and spent a lot of time at the COP with them, but they remembered Doc O'Leary.
Yeah, so I know him. He ended up going into USASOC, by the way. Okay. And he's a guy, as I told you, I spent a few days at Blessing, right? Yeah. And I went out there because I said, look, I'm in Bagram, or I was in Kandahar. I was in Bagram. And I said, I'm giving out surveys to people who aren't going outside the wire. That's not what leadership wants to know about. I need some guys who are going out there doing their job. And he said, all right, come out. He said, I guarantee you, I'll take you on some patrols. You're going to be throwing some grenades. You're going to experience some ticks. You're going to get out there. You're going to do some stuff. I said, well, okay, let me get out there close enough to talk to those guys. I'm not sure as a research psychologist you want me on that patrol, but he was a guy who, as you said, is memorable because there's another guy who was a psychiatrist who, this is an interesting one. You were talking about, you know, the communication. This is one we developed some resilience training for pre-deployment and for spouses. And one of the things we always talked about was, look, there is no right answer for what do you tell your spouse before you go. Some people want to know all the details when you're able to communicate back home. They want to know all that stuff. Others, they don't want to say, don't lie to me, but I don't want to hear about it because then I just worry about you more. And this psychiatrist was going out on patrols regularly. And he was telling his wife, no, as the psychiatrist, I don't do that. And he came back and he got his award. And they literally read it and they said, Doc was on 17 ticks during his time out here. And his wife was just like, that isn't what you were telling me. So it's just another one where, yeah, as I said, if you're with them and you're living with people, they're much more likely to open up, and that reduces a lot of the stigma. They get to know that it's not head shrink, and it's not, you know, they're going to pull your clearance. They're not going to pull you off the line. It's a matter of they're going to try to help you figure out how to make sure if you're having some struggles, you get through them.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed Doc O'Leary for the book, and he was really helpful. He had an interesting perspective. I quote him in there, but kind of just talking about, he knew that company so well, the one in the Korengal, that he just, you know, he could provide, you know, feedback of like, well, look, I mean, the loss of Staff Sergeant Rugel, that was a really tough one for the company because everybody kind of looked up to him. And you know, that one really reverberated, you know, within the unit more than some others did. I mean, it was a really interesting perspective to have. And I wished that I had been able to find kind of more people like him.
Yeah, that's, again, one of the challenges is some of that was based on relationships and the quality of the behavioral health officer, the quality of the psych tech who was their sort of go-to person who would go out there to the smoke pits, right, and sit around and talk to Bubbas and get a feeling for what's going on. And then the doc would know who to talk to, right? And they would do follow-up and have good care. So yeah, he is an exceptional dude. Yeah, so somebody asked about my thoughts on moral injury. So actually, I was part of a panel, a NATO panel, on looking at the psychological health effects of moral injuries. And I think it's an area that isn't been researched enough. and it isn't an area that we understand enough. But, you know, it's interesting on how some people go through the same experience and have to do things that for one resulted in a moral injury, where for others they were able to compartmentalize, or they were able to, you know, realize they had to do that for the mission or whatever it was. But I think that, again, I'm not a clinician, but I think there are things that linger with people. I remember talking to a guy from the 160th SOAR. That's the folks, for anybody who doesn't know, fly the special operations missions. And this pilot, who's an old warrant officer, and he said to me, "Sir, I don't have any mental health issues. Everybody I killed needed to die. I didn't good intel. They were bad guys. I have no problems with it." And he hesitated for a couple of seconds, and he said, "Doesn't mean it doesn't pop up in my sleep once in a while." And I thought, man, that's compartmentalizing right there, right? It never bothered him when he was in full, you know, awake, but when he kind of let it go and you're sleeping, it may, and that might be moral injury. That might just be, you know, processing memories. But I thought that was an interesting way to think about it. Yeah, resentment. I'll tell you, FOBITS is a term that was thrown around a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? FOBITS were people who never left the FOB. FOBITS got the same combat pay, the hazardous duty pay. They got to eat all that chow stuff. And the bubbas and the bubettes who were going outside the wire every day, or out on the cops and the FOBs, who got, you know, MRE sometimes. Sometimes they got some hot food. They get maybe one hot meal in a chow hall. Yeah, there was resentment. So yeah, that point, John, you're spot on, man. There was a big difference, right? So, yeah.
Well, we also want to get actually.
Can I add something in there too?
Sure, Peter. Yeah, that we'll get to the withdrawal of the troops after your comment.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say one thing to remember too. This is something that always came up, especially when I was doing Uber for a little bit when I moved back to Pittsburgh. I'd get Marines in my car, and you know they'd see that I was in the Army and all that, and they'd be like, "Well, I did 2 tours in Iraq," and I'm like, "Okay, I did 2 tours in Iraq," and they're like, "Oh, so we're the same?" I was like, "No," and they're like, "What do you mean?" I said, "You did 2 tours equaling a year. I did 2 tours equaling 26 months," and they would like scratch their head, like, "What?" I was like, "Yeah, I spent like 3 times longer than you there." I was like, the Army's one of the few that does 12 months. The Air Force, the other services, they all do 6-month tours for the most part, you know.
Yeah, Peter, I'll tell you though, when you look at mental health rates and you look at combat exposures, soldiers and Marines are really similar. And I remember when TBI was really emerging, it was PTSD and TBI as a signature series of the wars. I remember talking to a Marine who had been involved in Fallujah. And he said, "Yeah, these TBI thing." He said, "So I've been knocked out 3 times. So what? I still do my job." And I just thought, man. So I think, you know, just a very quick story. I remember being in an airport and, you know, I get a combat patch. I went really short. So I literally went a month, 2 months for my deployments just to get that assessment, come back, brief senior leaders, run it all the way up through the Pentagon, release it to the media. But I remember feeling guilty because I got my first combat patch for like just over a month deployment. And I ran into a guy who was in Vietnam, and he said, "Oh, yeah, you guys are," I was in uniform with another guy. And he goes, "You guys were in Iraq or Afghanistan?" We said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, I was in Vietnam." He goes, "Well, sort of." And we said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I was on a plane and we were on a helicopter getting ready to touch down, and it was shrapnel or a round, took out my eye. So I never really got my feet down on the ground." And I thought, it didn't matter how long you were really there. You had one bad day, one bad experience. It could change the rest of your life. Now, the chances of those bad experiences got worse when you had 12-month, 15-month deployments. Absolutely, because you were going outside the wire, and just with numerics and and different people have different levels of what they were able to handle. And it also, some leadership went in there, some cohesion, some coping skills they brought in, all impacted in that. But I would just, anybody who went, no matter how long, there was the opportunity for bad stuff to happen that could impact them the rest of their life. And also
Dennis,
for them to do some good stuff.
I have to share with you my favorite joke. How do you kill a Marine?
Here we go.
Brad Washaball, my Marine buddy from RTI, is shaking his head. So I don't know. I guess you're going to want to give us it. So how do you do it?
You throw sand against the wall and tell them to hit the beach.
All right, we're cutting you off.
Brad's
Peter.
like, well,
We're cutting you off, Peter. All right. Hey, let me welcome Rodney Lopez. I know I haven't seen you in a while, Rodney. Good to see you. He's joining us. He's a Marine.
Hey guys, thanks Todd. Appreciate the intro.
He's Future Operations Base, a nonprofit in Houston. I just wanted to know if you wanted to drop in to share any news about what's going on with Future Operations Base. How have you been?
We've been great. We've been very busy. COVID's opening up. Texas has opened up a lot. So COVID ran through my house. You know, I'm a caretaker of my parents. My dad's a Vietnam Army veteran. We all got the virus and all that, got it all out of our systems. Yeah, the Future Operations Base, I just heard the comment about the FOBETs, you know, the FOBs. And so, you know, and I took that and spun it off of that, right? The forward operating bases where you came in to get hot chow, you came in to get a good night's sleep, you came behind the wire for security, right? That was your place before you came home, you know? And that's pretty much what how I came up with the name with Future Operations Base, coining that, you know, FOB, right? So I thought that was pretty cool that was brought up. So yeah, we're doing pretty good. Todd, thanks for asking.
Very good. And if you have any news that you want to share, you could drop it here in the chat. I put your the link to your website here. I'll put it also on the Facebook side. Thanks. Welcome. And I also want to point out, we had somebody, Iron Horse. I don't know who you are. I just wanted to welcome you. You certainly do not have to say hello, but if you'd like to, that'd be great. Robert Ramming, you've joined us before, but I haven't said hello to you yet. Please do feel free to unmute yourself if you want to just say hi or chime into the conversation.
Thank you.
I know we haven't even gotten to the question that has animated, this was supposed to animate this whole this whole evening conversation, which is, should we stay or should we go? And you know, I think that can be an ongoing conversation, but I do see that Deborah is with us. Deborah Benora had an interesting job in the Army. She was a broadcaster, an Army broadcaster. And so when we were talking about what you knew about the war when you were in Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam, you put an interesting question here in the chat. Deborah, why don't you just say your question here so I don't have to find it?
Sure, no, I will say it. I was a broadcaster in the service, and those of you that were stationed overseas, AFKN, you know, Armed Forces Korea Network, Armed Forces Germany, right? I mean, did any of you watch any of that? Those were back in the day, that was what you had to watch. That was before the internet, right?
Right. Right.
Did that mean anything to y'all? This is before the internet. I mean, was that where you got your news? Because back when I served, that was what it was. You got your news basically from us, well, from Armed Forces Radio and Television, or like CNN wasn't even really out there well, CNN was just getting out there. Yeah. I served in the 80s, so I don't want to jump into it. But so I always wondered, were we just the good news people? I myself served as the good news people. I only went out as an electronic broadcaster. I went and gathered the news. I specifically went after good news and put you on television. But I wondered if the studios back at the bases only broadcast good news. And so that was a question that I had for you, and I'll turn around and give it back to you. But anyway, I just want to say I love this Veterans Broadcast Club. I love listening to all of you. First of all, kudos to you, Todd, and you, Sean. I mean, this is wonderful. And I love listening to all these stories. I can't believe how wonderful it is to connect again after 30 some years. It just means so very much. So
Well, thank you, Deborah. Yeah, and once you serve it, it quite never leaves you, and you have the bond across generations and across eras and even branches of service, despite what Peter has said about the Marines. I've never said anything.
I love the Marines.
No kidding. Well,
They
I
just
have to
have their
claim,
spot to do. That's all.
I have the benefit though of claiming cross-pollination because I was Army, but I was stationed at Kelly Air Force Base, and I was assigned to a joint command, Army and Air Force, and I did stories about all four branches of the military. So my job was to find out what was the most interesting thing going on about all four branches of the military at the time and go get that story. So.
Well, I love that Ben Wright and Bill Boswell in the chat here said yes, that they absolutely listen to Armed Forces Radio and TV. And then John Hawes, tell me, we'll get on to our question, but John put a wonderful anecdote here in the chat. You want to share it?
Yeah, we never watched much AFN TV. It was always on in the chow hall. And I can tell you, I've watched the Super Bowl from Afghanistan and in Cuba on separate deployments. And it is the most disappointing experience ever because they remove all of the regular civilian commercials. And everybody watches the Super Bowl for the commercials.
Exactly.
The only reason you watch the Super Bowl is for the commercials, unless the Steelers are playing. Sorry, Mary Klepper.
Instead, you end up watching all these, D-list military members with, some sort of safety commercials and stuff like that. And it really ruins the experience.
Have you not used Jergens lotion lately due to wartime shortages?
That's great. That's great.
All right. I'm going to get us to our main question tonight, which
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, no problem, Todd. I love when you have fun. Should we stay? Should we go? Obviously, it's happening. We're going. This is set for September 11th. We have a lot of points of 4, getting them out of there. And that includes, if we can get them out of there, we're not going to prevent a civil war. In fact, there's kind of already one happening. So getting the troops out of there isn't really preventing this from happening. It's going to happen. And in that case, also, we're expecting the Taliban to probably attack the cities that are there, possibly in the same vein as a Tet offensive. So no matter what, 3,500 troops, American troops that are there right now, it's not going to probably stop this, save the American blood and treasure and time. The peace talks have stalemated and really staying sort of may elongate that stalemate, potentially weakening our bargaining power. And not to mention the cost. If we get out, we're saving $5 billion per year. And we need to start focusing on other threats like Russia and China. And the constant redeployments that we've also heard of tonight would end for Afghanistan is probably another good positive thing of getting out of there. Wes, I want to come back to you to sort of respond to the 4 getting out of there. Where do you sit on the fence, if that's a valid question to ask?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to weigh in on for or against. I don't have an opinion, honestly. I think it's a situation where there are a lot of bad options. That's what insurgencies do. They put their opponents in situations where all the options are bad. And then that's what we're looking at. So, I mean, I think, I certainly understand the argument that the argument that it feels like we're abandoning the place, that, the lack of US air support will sort of allow the Taliban to just come cruising on into these cities and what then, and then what was it all for? I also sort of understand, and I think I agree. I mean, I think I agree with sort of the sentiment that, it's not a good time to leave, but there's not going to be a better one, which I think is a pretty important kind of thing to think about. Is what are we doing there going forward? I mean, there are these peace talks going on, but the United States has essentially, in later months of the Trump administration, given up all of the leverage that we had, right, by cutting the force level far beyond what was actually required under the timeline last summer and last fall. And so, there's the U.S. Taliban agreement, I think in some ways is a dead letter. I mean, we don't know. It expires the day after tomorrow, right? If the U.S. does not pull all of its troops out by Saturday, which it's not going to, then we're in violation of our main commitment under the agreement, right? The Taliban has not agreed to some extension or anything like that. So, we don't know. Will the Taliban react this weekend by starting to shell U.S. bases? Will it not? I think in some ways it doesn't matter because the U.S. forces who are in Afghanistan now are really battened down the hatches at their small footprints on a few large bases. And I wouldn't expect, whatever Taliban offensive comes, it's the Afghan government that's going to bear the brunt of it, not the United States. Even though it's the U.S. Taliban deal that's sort of collapsing. One thing that I hope people bear in mind is there's no war is ending. We have always been one combatant in a multi-party war, a war between the Afghan government and the Taliban and various other insurgent groups. There was a time there when we were a really major combatant. We were the biggest combatant fighting the Taliban. That time is long gone already. U.S. forces play a relatively minor supporting role in terms of what they do on the ground in Afghanistan over the past couple of years. So, our role there has shrunk considerably already. I think our kind of a lot of the things that you can argue to make us stay. I mean, the idea of we need an intelligence presence, we need the ability to go after Al Qaeda, and I think we're pretty blind about Al Qaeda in most of the country already. Having retracted from the kind of the far-flung outposts that we used to have. I don't think there's going to be a better time. I also don't think we should be too surprised if at some later point in this administration or the next administration, there are events that happen in Afghanistan that cause kind of a clamor for the U.S. to re-engage in some way.
A la Iraq in
a la Iraq. Now that could be, that could be a huge mistake. It could also be potentially an opportunity to kind of re-engage in a more in a better way. I mean, to create a relationship with the Afghan government that is less dysfunctional than the relationship we've had over the past 20 years. But I certainly hope that the Biden administration thinks long and hard about what its kind of red lines for re-engagement will be and thinks about them well ahead of time. Doesn't kind of wait for the day the Taliban are at the gates of Kabul or the day the Taliban overrun Kandahar to kind of decide, well, does this rise to the level where we recommit in some way? And I also really hope that the Army in particular manages to hang on to some of the knowledge that it's gained there. Not just kind of lessons learned for future wars, but very specific information about Afghanistan, so that if U.S. forces do wind up re-engaged, whether it's in some much more limited way, as I would hope, that it's not reinventing the wheel and just going in, bumbling, making all the same mistakes again.
Brad, do you have your hand up?
Yes, my concern is we still have enemy there. We still have a force that's committed to terrorist acts, and we're losing the ability to gain intelligence. And, I think President Biden said that we can react over the horizon if need be. And this, all the service chiefs, the military was consulted by the president. He did ask, and they all recommended that we stay. So, I think that's it's the power of a democracy where you can say your piece, but ultimately the civilian power is the one that has the final say. So, I worry about how we're going to gather intelligence and how we're going to attack from over the horizon. I mean, we're still attacking, we're still wanting to defeat these terrorist forces, but the means are going to be harder. I think General McKenzie, the commander of Central Command, who I know, said it pretty well. He said it's going to make our job a lot tougher. And the job isn't finished. I mean, the job of fighting terrorism goes on. We'll just have to find another way to do it and still be effective at the same time.
Do you feel, Brad, that and any of our veterans, that our intelligence gathering is now at such a much better level than it was back before 9/11 happened, that we have the capability of gathering that intel a lot better?
I believe so. I'm not an expert there, but we've had forces on the ground, special operation forces. I think we have learned a lot in the intelligence gathering means, and with agencies that have three letters to their names. I think what we don't know is exactly
what's planned to how we're going to combat terrorism in Afghanistan from over the horizon. And I'm not really sure about that. I worry about that.
If I could offer a response to that, I mean, I think I have pretty high confidence that the U.S. military will be able to strike over the horizon, as General McKenzie said. But like you, I really share the concern that remaining engaged intelligence-wise, I think is going to be a lot harder without the kind of the presence on the ground. I would add, though, I think a lot of the presence that has allowed our kind of exquisite intelligence collection in Afghanistan is already gone. I mean, we're at Bagram, we're at Kabul, we're at Kandahar Airfield. Very largely, the three-letter agencies are really reliant on the NDS, the Afghan Intelligence Service, already. I mean, I think we're going to be at an embassy footprint. Right now, we're at an embassy plus a little bit footprint. We're much closer to the embassy footprint than we are to the footprint of having combat outposts spread out all over the country with human intelligence collectors at them. So I worry that we're already a little blind in Afghanistan. I think there's one of the big questions is kind of like, well, what threat will be important enough to bring us back, right? I mean, there are two major international terrorist groups that have presences in Afghanistan. One is ISIS and the other is Al-Qaeda, the one that brought us there in the first place. But I think we have to be really careful when we're thinking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS to think about what they are in Afghanistan and what Afghanistan is to them. So, for instance, the branch of ISIS that exists in eastern Afghanistan, it has a very different character from the branches of ISIS that exist in, say, Iraq and Syria, where the caliphate had its core and where it planned attacks out of, launched attacks into Paris and elsewhere. There's never been any, and this is something that I talked a lot for the book about with General Miller and his intelligence guys. There has not been an international terrorist plot either executed or disrupted that's been traced back to ISIS-K, the Afghan branch of ISIS. The Afghan branch of ISIS is much more there are up in Kunar, the area that the book is about, the hardest place. It's a collection of Salafi groups for whom the Taliban was never really a natural fit, but they signed on to the Taliban because the Taliban was fighting the United States. Now, when ISIS came along in 2015, some of these little groups all jumped ship for ISIS. And that's essentially what you're looking at in places like the Korangal, for instance, is a place that the Korangal became, an ISIS stronghold in the sense of the local militants there declared themselves to be ISIS. Now, Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, I think, as we all know, I mean, Al-Qaeda is where Afghanistan is where Al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks from, planned a variety of other international attacks from. But today isn't 20 years ago. And I think we have to be pretty clear-eyed about sort of what is Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and what are Al-Qaeda's other strongholds. I mean, where are kind of the dangerous places that really require a level of military effort. I mean, 10 years ago, Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan was a real base for Al-Qaeda. It was under severe pressure in the tribal areas from the CIA's drone campaign. And it saw the northeastern part of Afghanistan as a potential safe haven for its senior leadership. Today, the situation is very different. A lot of Al-Qaeda's senior leaders live in Syria, in the city of Idlib. The Syrian civil war has opened up huge opportunities for Al-Qaeda that in some ways, what's left in Afghanistan can't match. If you're looking to plan attacks in Europe or the United States, the strategic stronghold of Idlib, not far from the Mediterranean, is a far more attractive place to be and work than someplace way up in the Waigal Valley. So I think that's something that, when the CIA director testified the week before last that Al-Qaeda does not have the capability in Afghanistan to strike the United States, I think that's kind of what he's talking about, is the way that Al-Qaeda has shifted its own effort and its own center of gravity as its global situation has changed. But of course, the question there is, as the CIA director testified, will they still not have that capability if our kind of counterterrorism pressure goes away in Afghanistan, or will they, just to make a point, regrow it? To show that they can regrow it in a place that we've pulled out of, because that's very central to Al-Qaeda's whole narrative, is the idea that they participated in the defeat of the Soviet Union. And that they'd like to participate in the defeat of the United States in Afghanistan as well. So, Afghanistan, whatever its practical value to Al-Qaeda, which I think is relatively low, its symbolic value to Al-Qaeda is very high. And that's it's a really complicated question that we're going to have to kind of be looking at in the months ahead, especially because our Afghan government partners, the NDS intelligence service that works with the CIA, it will be very much in their interest to ring the alarm bell about every Al-Qaeda operative that they get a whiff of anywhere in Afghanistan to sort of try and get the US to re-engage. But as kind of the story that I tell in the book shows, not all Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan are created equal. I mean, there was a guy that we chased for 10 years called Abu Ikhlas al-Masri, who was kind of the most visible Al-Qaeda operative in Eastern Afghanistan. But when they finally caught him and talked to him, it turned out that he was not in the part of the organization that does international terrorism. He was essentially the Al-Qaeda equivalent of a Green Beret. He was charged with going out and advising the local Taliban in their fight against the government. So that there are fine distinctions within Al-Qaeda about who poses what kind of threat, and I think we're going to lose a lot of our ability to make those distinctions as we as our own intelligence assets go away, and as we become more reliant on liaison with partner intelligence services, the Afghan NDS, who really have a vested interest in keeping us there.
I see that George. I'm sorry. I see that George Kniss has his hand up, but I also saw that Dennis did too, and Deborah did too briefly. So I want to give Dennis and Deborah a chance, and then we could go to George.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out there that the question that matters to me is the guys who were there. What do they take, right? Because they have to have meaning for those who lost somebody there, or those who lost part of somebody themselves, or part of them, even themselves over there. What's their thought on it, right? Do they feel like we wasted our time, or do they feel like, hey, when we were there, we did our job? Because what Brad was talking about, right, is enemies and getting bad guys. I remember the talk was we're going to democratize, right? We're going to make all of Afghanistan a democracy. And I just thought, you're right. You're kidding me, right? These guys are worried about eating. They're not worried about this wonderful thing called democracy, right? They're growing poppy because poppy pays so they can eat, have food. So I think it really matters. And Brad's right? It's the civilian leadership who makes these decisions. I think for my concerns is the people who were there, who lost people, or had an experience there. Are they going to feel like they wasted their time? Or are they going to feel like, I'm glad we're not going back because now none of my other brothers or sisters are going to die over there? So that's just what I would throw out for people to think about. Over.
Steve, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, I was actually going to say something about exactly what Dennis is talking about, which is I'm not one of those guys that really thinks too much about the tactical sort of history of Afghanistan. I'm just a guy that was there, and the military has never been a huge part of my life. It was a job I did, and now I do something else. So, but for me, we did have a very hard deployment, very difficult. I lost friends. Terry Hearn was a friend of mine. He was killed at Fob Shank. We lost, I think, 3 or 4 people from our battalion. And for me, there's 2 moments that define the war for me. And one is, sorry.
It's all right. You can take your time, Steve.
When I got off the plane to come back home, we were in a airport, we flew commercial, and we were we had a brief minute in between one flight to another. We were in this Atlanta gift shop, and this lady came up to me right after we got back, and she shook all our hands and did a thank you for your service thing, and she just said, I'm so glad that we got done fighting over there. And it's because when I was there was when Obama announced a big drawdown. And I think a lot of people got the impression that we were done when we weren't. I mean, when I was there, it wasn't how it was. And that stuck with me, just the way that it felt like, it felt like we were forgotten before we ever left. And so for me, I wonder if the ending of the war is a way to put that in history. And then very briefly, the second thing was my actual brother went to Afghanistan last year. And that was something that struck hard to me because I felt in a sense that I went so that my family wouldn't have to. And so I wonder if ending the war it's something that we, at least we could put it into history. It's over, and we don't have to live with the constancy of it anymore. But that's all my thoughts.
Thank you for that, Stephen. It is some level of closure. Very powerful.
George Kness.
Yeah, so many things, so much. But I got a couple comments and one question is that I'm just appalled that this war, which was a NATO action, the first use of Chapter 25 for NATO to take action with us on a common attack. It had such promise in the beginning, and I just see the same mistakes that were made in Vietnam. So many parallels, so many screw-ups, really, that the way this came out. And I think there are probably Vietnam veterans right now are thinking this Afghan war is going to turn out just like Vietnam, a failed war full of huge mistakes, too much of a long-range, whimsical dedication to democracy. And there are countries out there that are completely failed countries, and that's why terrorists exist in them, and revolutionary movements and everything. And the American military cannot solve those. And I think Vietnam was our first slap in the face on that. I just feel that the Afghan veterans will be marked with a failed war like we were. You guys that served there are about to get slapped with a failed war. And I think it's going to be ugly when this thing falls apart, when Afghanistan, a completely failed at war country, internally fighting for half a century or more, is just going to go on. And you guys are going to be stuck with it, that we did another failed war with $2 trillion and those lives lost and made no progress. I just think there are not military solutions for all the failed countries out there. And the one thing I thought that was an error in this discussion, there was no discussion whatsoever of the involvement of Pakistan in supplying material arms that kept this fight going for all this time, and that was never addressed, that was never spoken of, just like we had the Ho Chi Minh Trail that undermined the war in the South. Pakistan is the core of what goes on in Afghanistan. The Soviets learned a lot from that war. They made some progress. There was a threat to them, and it was a threat to us. And it was so sorry that we could not get together, realizing we had a common enemy with a failed Afghanistan. So I'm sorry, I see bad parallels with our experience in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George. Wes, I see you shaking your head with the idea that Pakistan was sort of helping to supply the war here in Afghanistan.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I won't go on at length about it, but I mean, I think if there are a couple of big structural issues that prevented our kind of nation building effort there from ever being successful, ever having a hope of success. One of them would be the structure of the government itself, the fact that it did not feel like a legitimate government to many, many Afghans who saw it as kind of a predatory, extractive government, and that our effort was kind of tainted by association. And then second, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was every day for the past 20 years, the insurgency has had a safe haven from which it can plan its operations, send in its arms, treat its wounded, all the things that it needs to do. It can do from this safe haven. And that has been a crippling factor every step of the way. Absolutely.
I know we're going past time here a bit. We won't go too far past 8:30. Thank you all for sticking with us. We'll be wrapping up here shortly. Dennis, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just, when Jordan was talking about parallels, I want to point out one thing that was not a parallel is what Steve referred to, right? When you guys came home from Vietnam, you got a very different reaction than what Steve got, what I got, what John got. what everybody else who was over there got, either Afghanistan or Iraq, where people thanked you. And I think that's something that was owed to you guys.
Yep.
So that, thank God, wasn't a parallel, right? We got separation, even when people thought it was bad, that, with bad intel, why we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, people always separated.
Yeah.
And said, you're a soldier.
The warrior from the war.
Mhm.
Right. So hopefully that has an impact. But, obviously there's meaning different ways you get it, right? You took care of your buddies, you made it back, all that kind of thing. We at least didn't have that. Yeah. So I just wanted to point that out, George. Thank God it wasn't a parallel there. Over.
And I'm so glad, Dennis, sir, that you ended that way. I know you guys are talking about we got to go, and I'm not familiar with Zoom, and if we're going to get cut off or anything. So I'm sorry that I jumped in.
No worries. We will not cut you off, Deborah.
We'll warn you. Yeah, we'll warn you when we pull the plug.
Yeah.
Put out the hook.
Yeah.
But, George, I have to jump in only because, I appreciate it. I've appreciated you on prior programs and appreciate you tonight. But I have to say this. I heard you say, you guys are going to get stuck with like a failed war. And, I respect you and respect all of what you say. But I must say this to you guys here. That is probably the only thing, not the only thing, but the biggest thing that the United States of America, when we wear our uniform, it says U.S. Army or U.S. Marines, jugheads, whatever, that's the biggest thing those shoulders wear is, I'm not getting stuck with a failed anything. The United States of America shoulders whatever those things are. I bear what is my mission. What is my mission today? What is my mission here? What is my mission there? Did I fight for it? Did I do it right? This is my goal and I did it right. Right? You gotta do that kind of thing. So you're not getting stuck with anything. So you've got to be always positive. And I just everything within me just kind of wanted to jump up there and only reject that one little negative, feeling of getting stuck with a negative word. I know you're not a negative person, George, but I wanted to say.
Let me explain though, Deb.
Yeah, please.
That's exactly. The Vietnam veterans separate the personal experience of the war from the failed policies. That's a distinct, and I think that's what you're talking about.
Okay.
We to keep our good mental health through all that, through a failed war, we did not fail. We think the policy failed.
Okay.
And
it's
some
so great
leadership
to hear you
failed.
say that. Thank you for
So
eloquently.
there's a distinct difference.
Yeah.
You managed, Deborah. I think you've managed to uncover Dan Vaughn, who rarely shows his camera. So thank you, Deborah. Thank you, George, for that. How are you doing,
Can you
Dan?
hear me, Todd?
Yeah, how are you?
Me?
Good to see you.
Okay, how are you? In regards to the Vietnam policy, like I told you before, Todd, our government sent us there. And while we were there, we didn't fight for our government, our country, or our flag, because you can't wave those in battle. We fought for each other. I'll watch your back, you watch mine. That's how we made it through Vietnam. That was the good part of doing that, watching each other. The rest of it stunk, but that was the best part.
Marines speak straight. I love it, Dan. Thank you. Leo West, how are you?
Oh, pretty good.
Good.
I'm reminded of a sergeant we had who had gone into North Africa, went up through Italy, eventually ended up in Austria, got discharged. When Korea broke out, he was sent back to Austria. He got his old bed back, and he was our philosopher. And one of his favorite sayings was, all armies screw up, or they're all screwed up. And the one that screws up the most is the one that loses.
Boy, is that well stated. Leo, as a historian, that from the historian's point of view, that does seem to be how it works when you go back and look in history. And I just want to point out, we have also have two other World War II vets with us. We have Julia Parsons. Hello, Julia, Navy wave in World War II. We have Warren Goss, who landed on Utah Beach on June 6, 1944 with the 531st Special Brigade. Hello, Warren. And I want to welcome you guys, and feel free to chime in if you want to say anything here.
Well, I also thought I'd go to John Hawes here as
John,
one of our last comments. Nice long comment, but I thought you might mention it, John.
Yeah, I'm all for the drawdown in Afghanistan. And the reason being, we went in there to get bin Laden. We went in there to exact revenge for 9/11. And we've done that. We've taken out, killed, or captured 99% of anybody who had anything to do with 9/11. The original, conflict wasn't necessarily to deal with the Taliban. The Taliban harbored bin Laden. We gave them an ultimatum, and they didn't want to, uphold it. So, we went in there after them. But I remember being a junior or, freshman in high school, and just learning about the Taliban pre 9/11. Literally visiting their website, and the irony of a culture that didn't believe in technology, still having a website to push their propaganda. Said this is pre 9/11, but now much of our effort, especially conventionally, in particular conventionally, is to impose our American ideals on them. To give women the right to vote, to build the schools, build the road systems, make them this small democratic country. And the thing is, they've existed in their clan form, their current state, in particular in the Kunar and Nuristan provinces, these remote areas of Afghanistan, much longer than the US has. And they've seen multiple foreign invaders, the British, the Russians, us, come and go, and they're absolutely fine with their way of life. Who are we to go in there and say that, hey, you need to change and be like us? We're the new kid on the block, and now it's, I feel, the sacrifice, the bloodshed for pushing our ideals on another culture halfway around the world. It's not the reasons we went there. We went there to exact revenge for 9/11, take out bin Laden, Al Qaeda. We did that. I put multiple terrorists in the ground myself. Got a lot of satisfaction for that. But, I didn't go there to ensure, free democracy for the people, and be the world's police. And a lot of soldiers feel the same.
Thank you for that, John.
Well put.
Yeah. I want to wrap up here, and I want to thank everybody for their time tonight. Todd, I want to pop over to you. I know this is our last Thursday night for Generation 9/11. We'll be rolling this program into our Monday night programming, and joining me next week for the Scuttlebutt, Wes, we're going to dive into a bit more of your war journalist background. Very interested and excited for that. Also diving more into your book, The Hardest Place. John Haas, you'll be joining us as our veteran on the program. Sort of you are in the same region as Wes. It'll be great to hear both of you on the Scuttlebutt podcast. That'll be released in about 2 weeks. But Todd, I want to pop over to you for any final thoughts.
Yeah, well, wonderful conversation. It's one that we're going to continue to have through the rest of the year, because it sounds like this is going to be up for debate at least through September 11th. So I think we're going to revisit it. I'd love to get more veterans and more conversation about this. I want to thank Dennis. Thank you, Wes. Thank you, Steve. Great to meet you here on Zoom.
You're welcome.
Fellow
anytime.
Mount Lebanonite. It's good to meet you. Thank you, Deborah, and to all of you who joined us. We'll be back Monday night at 7 p.m. And we're going to focus a conversation on missing MRAs, the recovery of MIAs, and with two organizations, Missing Marines and History Flight. And one of the officers of History Flight is this fascinating Marine, legendary Marine, Justin LeHue, who is called the Hero of Nasiriyah. He was retired after 26 years as a Master Sergeant in the Marine Corps. And there is, in fact, a LeHue Challenge in basic training at Parris Island named after him. He's a recipient of the Navy Cross. He's going to be joining us Monday night at 7 to talk about his work with History Flight, recovering remains of MIAs around the world, and also Missing Marines. And we'll have George Roker from Missing Marines with us. So hope you could join us Monday night.
Thank you, Steve, Dennis, George, Bebra, Wes. It's Steve, Aurora. Thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Bye, Aurora. We want to see you again. All right, take care. See ya. Have a good